Okay, folks, so I'm going to be doing a Q&A. Ask me some astrology questions. And this is going to be about astrology, not about your chart. I'm not going to be doing chart readings. And it's an opportunity, all the stuff you've heard me talk about in my videos and whatnot. I have all these videos about planets and houses and signs and ascendants and all that kind of stuff. And here we go. Somebody posting their birth chart right away. NR, I don't care. I ain't reading your chart. I already said it. Ain't doing it. So it's not about that. It's about learning something. So people who have questions about astrology. I see some students here. Lynette is here. She's a advanced astrology student doing readings. I see Juan Pablo Penaloza here, another one of my students. Again, NR, tell you about your career with your chart. I ain't doing it. So, last time I'm going to say it. So, we're talking about answering some questions. And so someone just asked me about the part of fortune. And in Vedic astrology, we don't really use parts of fortune. That's actually from the Arabic tradition of astrology. But there was an amazing crossover that happened historically when the Arab astrologers interacted with the Indian astrologers. They developed a system that's called Tajika astrology. And in Tajik astrology, we also have things that are similar to the Arabic parts. Part of fortune is what's called an Arabic part. There's a part of fortune. There's part of, I don't remember all of the Arabic parts. But in the Vedic version of Persian astrology, it's called Tajik astrology, which is really fascinating. And we have what are called sahams, which are similar kinds of converging points where it sort of directly maps over to the Arabic parts. But I haven't really worked with it as much. It's a different system, and it's definitely very interesting. And mainly Tajik astrology, those principles are also used in things like what are called Varshpal, which is the annual chart. There's also what's called Muhurta, or auspicious time charts. And you use what are called these Tajika methods to delineate those kinds of things. So I'm looking at some questions as they roll in. There's a question: if Vedic astrology is constant, yet Western astrology changes, which is why the ascendants and houses change. How do you read the two as one? Well, I don't read the two as one. And you're obviously referring, I assume, to the zodiac and the precession of the equinoxes. Why would you read the two as one? You read them separately. They're different systems, okay? And Vedic astrology was developed to be with the techniques to be to be applied to a sidereal calculation, okay? All of the astrological texts that tell you how to calculate the ascendant, the yogas, all of that stuff, they say at the beginning of the texts, like Briyat Parashara Horasastra, Briyat Jatika, any other texts. I think even, what's the big, I'm getting old, there's another very large, it'll probably come to me. They say right at the very beginning that Rashis and nakshatras are aligned, that it's a sidereal. So when you see that at the beginning, it means that everything that follows starts with that point. That's the way the texts are laid out. They show you how to calculate first, then they give you the techniques. So Vedic astrology was conceived of sidereally. Western astrology also began sidereally back in Greece and whatnot. It didn't become a full tropical tradition until Persia, probably 8th or 9th century at the earliest. Then it was exported back into Europe. Then by that time they were using the tropical zodiac. And so what you have now as modern Western astrology has diverged very much from its roots when it was very similar actually to Vedic astrology. So again, try to make the two as one. This is some idea that people have in this modern day. They're two different systems, okay? So I would look at them differently, and instead of trying to do two things at once, find the system that works best for you. Both systems work. Both calculations are legitimate. And do it like that. That's what I would say. Mohana said, explain the significance of Rahu transiting over natal Ketu and vice versa. Yeah, great. Obviously, the vice versa would be if the transit was happening. You said transit Ketu conjoined natal Rahu is a significant transit as the nodes become whole, or, well, you're saying the kinds of things that one might say. You just have to analyze the transit. It's just the nodes at their halfway point. So when the nodes return to their full point, like natal Rahu joins natal Rahu and natal Ketu, that's the beginning of that 18-and-a-half-year cycle. Okay? And again, the specifics of that is whatever it means in your chart. That's the important part, is knowing how to evaluate Rahu and Ketu in your chart. Not the halfway point is just the halfway point in that process and within all of those significators. So these are the kind of questions people ask as if the answer can be simple. You're focusing on the simplest thing that you can identify, which is natal Rahu coming back over natal Ketu and vice versa, because that's the thing you see, as if that's the important part. The simple answer is it's the halfway point in the cycle, okay? But that implies that you know how to interpret the cycle. So the most important thing isn't that you identify the halfway point. That's a simple identification. That's just a visual identification of something. That's not the important part. You can identify anything. Interpreting those things is the skill. And this is the thing that astrology students get into. And, you know, when I teach my certification course and when I teach people about why they would want to take the certification course, one of the most important things that I say to people is that memorization is not mastery. Think about that, because we think because we've memorized a bunch of things to look for, that somehow that means we understand what it means, or that we think, okay, now I've identified this thing, now tell me what this thing is that I identified. But identifying something is just on the surface. It's just pattern recognition. That's the easiest thing in the world to learn. The hard thing to learn is how to interpret what you're recognizing. And again, a question like, what does natal Rahu come back to natal Ketu mean? It's so general because I don't know what the Rahu and Ketu are doing. That's the important thing. And so noticing that it's just halfway in the cycle, it's actually just like halfway in any cycle. You want to also understand this. The midway point of any cycle is going to show the midway point of that thing. And again, we maybe focus on Rahu and Ketu because it's two things, but this happens with all planets. It's called a synodic cycle. Every planet has a synodic cycle. And every time a planet comes back to its natal position, like let's say when you were born, Mars was in Leo. Every time Mars comes back to Leo, it resets your karma with Mars. Every 2 years, you have a reset with Mars energy. Every 2 years. So every 2 years, we work through a Mars cycle. Every 2 years, we get to encounter our frustration and our this and our that. Every year, we have a solar return. We look at that because it's important, because it's a birthday and all that. But all that is that the Earth has come back to its original point when you were born. That's what the birthday is. And that's a solar return. Of course, we also talk about a Saturn return because it's a large cycle, 28-year cycle. But again, halfway point in the Saturn cycle is very big. Halfway point in the Mars cycle, you're going to feel some stress. And by the way, this is what Western astrology is. It really is based a lot on these kinds of things. This is, in many ways, the living, organic beauty of Western astrology, because they really look a lot at transits in the sky to natal positions. That's a lot of their timing, and it's been hugely neglected in Vedic astrology. I do a lot of work with that. Those students who are here know that a big part of my predictive system is actually bringing in all of that dynamic transit work and coordinating that with the dashas. Because when you bring the dashas in, which is how your karmas are unfolding, again, that also implies that Rahu Ketu question. I have to know what the dashas are. I have to know, there's so much else going on, but every planet comes back to its original place. Again, and after 2 years, other planets are somewhere else. You're in a different dasha. But Mars is still going to reset. Every year, the sun resets. Every month, the moon resets. Because the moon comes back to its original place every month. It comes back to its original sign, its original nakshatra, its original tithi, or lunar phase. That's why in India, those of you who know Indian culture realize that you celebrate your lunar return every month. Especially we do it for saints, like with my saint, with my guru Amma, who was a saint, at her ashrams, because she was born when the moon was in Kritika Nakshatra, every month they have what's called a Kartika Puja, to Amma, because they're celebrating her every month when the moon comes back to the nakshatra she was born in. So every month we have a birthday. Every year we have a birthday with the sun coming back. Every 2 years you have a Mars return. You can also look at Venus, Jupiter, Mercury, all the planets. And the halfway point in that cycle, which again, it's going to be the opposite sign. It's going to be that opposite thing. Like I talked about the moon in Leo. If someone has moon in Leo, they're very focused on their individuality and this and that. The halfway point in that is moon in Aquarius, where there's a lot of tension and stress and pressure to compromise with others and the culture. And so we deal with that stress, right? And even the halfway point between that, what's called the square. Again, if you've heard Western astrologers talk about this, it's real and it works. Oh, they'll say Mars is squaring your natal Mars in the sky. These squares, Mars is trining your natal Mars. Mars is sextiling your natal Mars. Mars is opposite your natal Mars. They do this all the time. This is how they tell what's going on, and it works really good. So it's a good question about the double node return. I get asked that a lot. And the thing to know is that, again, it's more important to be able to interpret the nodes, which is quite tricky and quite complex, than to be able to recognize that it's halfway in the pattern. But everything halfway in the pattern is important. Okay? So someone says when Ketu is aspecting many planets, Ketu doesn't aspect. That's just what I would say. There's no aspects to the nodes. Okay? It's not in Parashara, and it really, to me, doesn't make sense, because the word for the aspect is drishti, which means light. The other planets give off light. You can see them and you can see their light shining. The nodes don't give off light. They're, in fact, the absence. They're a void, right? We see the nodes, they're shadows. So they're not casting an aspect. A shadow isn't throwing off light and seeing something. The word for drishti is glance or sight and seeing. And you need light to see. This is my philosophy around it, but even without my philosophy, there's no mention of Rahu and Ketu aspecting, especially in Parashara, and it doesn't make sense. So I would not pay much attention to the aspects of Rahu and Ketu, okay? And so a question about America and the Dasha. Not so into that. It was supposed to be Rahu, which one might say that it's Rahu Dasha, but I've been a little suspect about the birth time, about the birth chart of America. I'm not convinced that it's that Sagittarius one that everybody says. And I'll tell you why, because it's documented. You know, the Sagittarius birth time for the U.S. would have it's based on the Declaration of Independence being, I guess, signed or something around 6 p.m. or something like that. It was reported then, and it's also known now that they actually did that ratification and wrapped it up by about 10 a.m. I've always suspected that the ascendant is actually Leo. I don't remember what that would make the dasha, but, you know, I have, not always, but because there's so much that I can figure out in a very organic or in a very natural and certain way, like I can figure out for certain so many things that I gave up speculation and things that I can't know for sure a long time ago. That includes things like talking about past lives. I can't verify past lives, but I can say so many specific things about this life, and then you're in control of it. I don't even talk about past lives. Other things that I can't verify, like I'm not really sure about the birth time of the U.S. I know where the planets are, so if I do, I would talk about transits to the planets. The ascendant, I'm really not sure about because that birth time is really sketchy. I'm really surprised at how many people act as though it's, you know, learned fact or something. Even the person that conceived of it, we can't know for sure or what even it's based on. So even if you go and you Google Declaration of Independence time of ratification, or if you look, you'll see that it says around 10 a.m. everyone had finished and they adjourned or whatever. So anyway, if people use Sagittarius, then it's Rahu Dasha. Some people really think that timing is right on, and I'm not debating it by any means. I just don't. Again, it's something that I can't really verify, and I've also definitely looked at the Leo timing, and it works really well. But then I'd have to get in there and rectify, and I'm also just not that interested in it because I can also see very clearly the effects when you look at the transits to the natal positions, the planets themselves. That's a very, very legitimate way to work without an actual birth time, especially for things that are happening currently. And so again, but this is the chart of a country. By the way, the U.S. also seems much more like a Leo country, not a Sagittarius country. Okay? Maybe the idealism or the hope, but it seems the U.S. has been so imperialistic and conquering and, you know, very Leo. Anyway, so, yeah. All right, so what are we looking at here? Let me go up. What dasha? Gandantha points must be most intense around 29 degrees, right? Yeah. Can puja remedy really help? Yeah, there are pujas that are recommended. I don't have them off the top of my head. But, you know, you want to understand that a puja is really just kind of paying a priest to do something on your behalf. What really helps with all of your karma is sadhana. That's the great puja, you would say. One second. And again, I'm not saying that pujas don't work or that they're useless or anything like that, because they obviously do. But they're done for acute situations. And maybe Gandantha, and again, when you're asking about Gandantha, or I don't even know what you mean, like a Gandantha natal planet, or if it's something in your natal chart, again, a puja is not going to take away the karma. This is what I mean. Maybe at certain times when that energy is getting activated by the dasha, or then you're getting a lot of pressure on that point, maybe. But pujas relieve certain situations at certain times. Like when you're getting the real heavy, you know, difficulty of something. It can maybe help an external situation work out a little bit better. But it doesn't take away the karma. It doesn't remove anything. It's your karma. Karma means action. It means the actions you've performed that have created the circumstance that you have to go through. Okay? And again, a puja can help with a difficult the difficulty of especially an acute situation, right? But it's not going to make the karma, quote, go away, which means the actions you have to go through in order to get the wisdom from that difficulty. That's still there because that's your karma. Again, it's just very simple. It's like you can help someone, someone who's about to drown. You want to help them. You don't want them to drown. You don't want them to die. But let's say they drown because let's say they're handicapped and they drown because they're in a wheelchair. If you don't want them to drown, so you want to help them not drowned as they're crossing the river. But after they cross the river, they're still in the wheelchair. So a situation where you have a planet, and again, you mentioned Gandantha. I'm not using Gandantha as an example. I'm just saying in general. I'm not saying that Gandantha does that kind of thing. Yes, the 29 to the 1 degree, anything that gets closest to its most deficient is going to be more exacerbated in whatever we're talking about. So yes, the Gandantha is the most urgent as it gets closest to the shift between the two rashis and the nakshatra, that point. But I'm just talking about any kind of acute karmic circumstance. Gandantha can also be very good and very spiritualizing, and it can be a very natural thing if there's a lot of power there. And again, you just say Gandantha. There could be a lot of things that are Gandantha, like you could have the sun Gandantha at like 1 degree Leo, and it's in its own sign, and you might have the ascendant right there as well. And that's really powerful. The Gandantha is one thing, but, again, what it does, and aside from just, again, calling it something and wanting to be cured of its problem, again, this is the thing you always got to be careful with astrology, is putting things in good and bad categories and then saying, oh, this is a bad thing, so can a puja help me with the bad thing? Again, I'm not saying you're doing that necessarily, but we have to be careful of that thing because, of course, astrologers will say it all day as well without enough discrimination. So what the Gandantha shows is it shows this transition from one thing to the next. Any kind of sandhi, which means any transition from one sign to the next, is always going to be a place of uncertainty and instability. But usually between other rashis, between other signs, there's a nakshatra energy sort of holding it together. So like the transition between Aries and Taurus, Kritika nakshatra is there. The transition between Taurus and Gemini, Mrigashira nakshatra is there. Between Gemini and Cancer, Punarvasu nakshatra is there. But between Cancer and Leo, the rashi stops and the nakshatra stops. So it becomes more volatile. And it definitely is. And again, this is one of the reasons why I definitely have always maintained the sidereal Rashi and Nakshatra as is described in the text, because you really see the Aslesha Magha Gandantha is really powerful. The Jeshta Mula Gandantha, very transitional and destructive. Revati Ashwini is much more about liberation. But any transition between two rashis, and the planet its energy is sort of in transition, like when you're moving from one house to the next and you got all your stuff in 2 different places. You're not so together. That's the way to look at any kind of sandhi between 2 signs. When it's Gandantha, it's even more kind of disjointed. So the problem with Gandantha and sandhi is that it can be like a lack of attention. It can be kind of spaced out. It can be not paying attention. It can be not attached enough to something. Like, for instance, you get the 7th Lord, Sandhi or Gandantha, and you're just not really together with your partner. You're not paying attention to it. You're kind of spacey. You're sort of in and out. And, of course, you look at the specific signs and all that to see how it plays. But that's the issue with the Gandantha and with the Sandhi. Now, it's tempting to say that that's always bad. Well, that sounds bad. Why is that good? Because in many ways, it's kind of not of this world. It's sort of, if it's something that's really powerful and wise, like let's say Jupiter in this Gandantha between Scorpio and Sagittarius, especially right on the Sagittarius part, particularly if it's like in the 9th house or something for like a Aries, or a 5th house for a Leo or something, that could be extremely spiritual, extremely spiritualizing. it's going to show some difficulty, but it could be very powerful because Jupiter is in very high dignity, maybe in its own sign. So again, you always need to be careful coming at astrology from one point of view, thinking, oh, Gandantha, bad. Is there a remedy? The remedy would be good, and that kind of thing. Not that you did it, but you always need to be careful with that sort of thing, and understand that remedies are they don't remove they don't destroy karma, so to speak. The karma is still yours, and it's still yours to go through. All right, so I kind of. So this question about me, I don't know if it's just not that interesting. It might be a little, I don't know. So here we got another read my chart. Could you say anything? Okay. All right. Anyway, so as I say, I'm not here reading people's charts. Oh, there's a lot of questions here. Okay, so I like to go into things in depth. So I'm going to scan these a little bit. It's kind of... Okay, Gandantha points must be... Okay, there we go. Let me just check through some of these. Okay, so Vargotama planets, let's forget conjunct the nodes. Conjunct the nodes is just another thing. Again, you're just adding that. They're not... anything conjunct the node is conjunct the node, and you interpret that. That's that. Vargotama is when planets are in the same sign in the Rashi and whatever the harmonic chart is. It just makes it very solid and stable, because when it's in the Rashi chart, when it's in one sign in the Rashi chart, then you have to look at the sign it's in the other harmonic chart to see how together that energy is and how congruent it is. And then it's not just Navamsha, it's Dasamsha or Saptamsha or whatever. You have to look at how much congruence is there. So when they're in the same sign, then there's a lot of alignment. If that Mars is in Leo in the Rashi chart and in the D10, then the person in their career is going to be very aligned with that Mars in their overall nature, which is the Rashi chart. So Vargotama just means, this is why it's powerful, because we read each individual harmonic chart to show the native in that area of life first, in general. So when it's the same sign, which is what Vargotama is, it shows a lot of congruence. And it shows that there's a lot of alignment. When it's not, like if that Mars is in Leo in the Rashi chart, but then it's in, Virgo in the D10, well, that's a very different sign. It's a more analytical and it's not as courageous. So in their career, even though that Mars in Leo is very powerful, in the career, they might be kind of sheepish and a little frustrated. Okay? So this is always, it's just what you would expect. Again, in many ways, astrology is not that hard. It's just what you would expect. Okay? Again, you've identified something called Vargotama, and then what does it mean? It means what you think it means. It's in the same sign. What would that mean if it's in the same sign? Well, then it's very similar energy in that area of life. Okay, Sri Lagna. I'm just kind of filtering through things that Upagrahas. It's a little bit more to talk about. Most of Upagrahas, they're quite important. Tyler, honestly, I haven't studied them as much as I perhaps could have. It's something that I, at some point, want to get more into the Upagrahas, because I think they're quite important. They're mainly calculation points, but they're very. I think they're quite important. But I haven't as yet done as much research into them. Bhava charts necessary. So some asked about the exact time of birth, wisdom about determining the ascendant. You have to know how to rectify. And again, it's a question. It depends on how close a birth time is. Some people have absolutely no idea what the time is. Some people know within a few hours. Some people don't even know if it's that day. There are different grades of possibility, but you can do readings without the ascendant, again, by doing things like reading transits to the natal planets. You can also use some of the Jaimini methods, especially using the Karakamsha, especially if the longitude of the moon doesn't change the Karakamsha, then you can read a lot of those indicators as well. There's a certain amount of work that can be done, but it's a little bit prohibitive. But again, if it's within a couple hours, any decent astrologer should be able to rectify. I can rectify usually I can rectify within 5 minutes if it's just between 2 ascendants or 3 ascendants. If it's I don't have no idea, that's harder. If it's sometime in the morning, a little easier, but you want to shoot for the right ascendant because it allows you to do much more specific work. Bhava charts, okay, that's a good question. You want to understand something about Bhava charts. Okay? One of the things that's very important to understand, and it's also talks about the zodiacs, or it also really lands the concept of India and the sidereal zodiac application. India didn't just use the sidereal rashis as the anchor for the entire practice, which obviously they did, but this is the reason why they also use the full house, full sign system, because everything is nailed to the sidereal sky, not just rashis, but also houses, because they're nailed to the ecliptic. The sidereal zodiac is the ecliptic. We're finding the planet on the ecliptic. That means if it's at 6 degrees Aries, then it's 6 degrees Aries Rashi, and that is a sector of the sky that falls relative to another sector of the sky. So that entire Rashi is that house. So we're not calculating Bhava houses. Bhava houses are mainly based on finding our place on Earth. Okay, so India didn't start calculating Bhava houses until they started mixing with the Tajika astrologers. And there's only one that I know of, which is the Shripati Bhava system. And Shripati was brought forth around the 11th century. I'm pretty sure that's the date. That's the date that I've seen. This is well after they mixed with the Persian astrologers and started doing Tajika astrology, which again is really fascinating, where you have obviously purely sidereal Indian astrology being practiced with like Western, we call it Western now, but Western astrology actually came from Persia. It started in Greece, disappeared, showed up in Persia. The Persians then developed it and exported it back into Europe. At the time, though, the Persians were mixing with Indians using their math, and all these calculations were shared. And you see this fascinating hybrid called Tajik astrology. But again, India still used pure full sign, full house. Again, because you're finding the planet on the ecliptic. Bhava houses, like you have 50 of them in Western astrology, is because Western astrology is finding your place on Earth. Your place on Earth first, because it's about projecting the tropical zodiac into the sky. The zodiac isn't connected to the ecliptic in Western astrology. It's connected to the seasons. And I'm not judging it. I'm not judging it as wrong. This is why they have all these Bhava houses, all these Bhava. This is why I don't really use Bhava houses. I think there's legitimacy in it. I think there's some use to it, especially when planets get at the very end of a sign and a house. So there are ways, there are definitely uses for Bhava charts. But the only one that's native to India that I know of is Shripati, and it came around the 11th century after the Indians mixed with the Persians, with the Arabs and the Persians and the Islamic astrology. They always give it like 3 names: Islam, Persia, Arab. It's a complicated history in that part of the world. So I recommend stick with full house, full sign system. And by the way, purist Western astrologers, I don't want to speak for them, but the last I heard, astrologers like Rob Hand and other well-known and renowned classical Western astrologers also went back to full house, full sign. I think it's a way to try to reconnect with the ecliptic, but they're still using the tropical calculation. But definitely you can see modern Western astrology with all of those different house systems is trying to better locate your position on Earth in relationship to that tropical projection into space. Whereas India is directly nailed to the ecliptic, sidereal rashis, and full sign, full house, 12, 30-degree sectors. That's what the zodiac is based on. So, good question about Bhava charts. I don't find them necessary at all to make predictions. I don't use them, frankly. Everything revolves around the planets as house rulers, that compound relationship, yogas, aspects, harmonic charts, and then things like retrograde, combustion, parivartana yogas, all of these things. It's so much to deal with. And when you keep the integrity of the full house, full sign system, I don't see any reason usually, in fact, ever, to really depart and use bhava charts. If you do, I would just say to use Shripati, but again, this was developed after they mixed with the Tajiks, with the Persians and the Arabs. So I don't do much with Dagda Rashis, frankly. I just never got much out of it. And Yogi, Ava Yogi, Dagda Rashis, I just never got much out of it. So not saying it doesn't work. Again, it's one of those things where I don't really understand the logic behind it, frankly. By the way, it refers back to another question that was asked about the parts of fortune and all that. This is one of those kinds of calculations, the Yogi, Ava Yogi, and then the Dagda Rashis. I'm not saying it's not legitimate, but it's one of those things that, again, I really started to dial in things that I know worked. I understood why they worked, and they worked predictably all the time. And I knew exactly what I was saying when they came up. And, I did that. I started doing that. My practice really coalesced around that about 10 years ago. Since then, I've just been perfecting that over and over again. And things like Dagda Rashis, Ashtaka Varga, Vimshopaka, Shadbala. There's a lot of things. Again, it's not that they don't work. It's just that you can't do everything. There's so many different ways to calculate stuff. At some point, God bless you if you can find a way to make karmas work and where you can really understand it predictively. And those students who are here that have taken my advanced predictive classes know that I teach predictive methods that work, and they work consistently. And it's hard to do. So, all those other things work. I'm sure Dr. Rashi's work and all of that. But again, it's these things that are based on sort of bewildering calculations, especially those kinds of things, even like Arab parts and the Sahams and all of that. It's all these calculations of midpoints between this and that. It's just not very intuitive for me either. And for me, often, if I don't really understand the calculation so much, I'm not so excited. Like I explained about the Gandantha, right? I didn't just say, oh, it's good or bad. I explained what it is. And it's conceptualized in a way that makes a lot of sense. It's things shifting between two different points, which is like when we're in transition. That makes perfect sense to me. So again, one of the things you want to do is find these things that you really understand. And often it's the easiest things, but taking something that's obvious and going really deeply into it. Like, what does that mean? How does that relate to something that's not just some bewildering calculation or some judgment or something I've been told is bad or whatever? How does that really come to life? That's what you want to try to do. Someone talked about Saturn and Mars in the 8th house of Scorpio. Well, if it's 8th house of Scorpio, that means it's an Aries ascendant, so Mars is in his own sign. So anytime Saturn and Mars are in the same sign, it brings a lot of destruction to that area of life. Not necessarily bad. We have to destroy a lot of things. So destroying 8th house things could be very powerful. It could give a lot of spiritual power and siddhis and capacity to do yoga and all that stuff, especially if the ruling planet is one of them. But a person would have to watch, I say you because it's probably your chart, you have to watch that resentment and the frustration and the bitterness and the coldness of Saturn, which can tend to make things catalyze and calcify. And you definitely have to do things to move that energy. Martial arts would be great, of course, yoga, staying disciplined and not fearful. But anytime Mars and Saturn are in any house or sign or whatever, it tends to destroy the worldly quality of that thing. This is why it can be difficult if it's in a place that you want to get something, right? 8th house isn't usually something we want to get. It's something we want to be protected from and want to be courageous with. But you always got to be careful, by the way, with Mars in the 8th house, because we can be reckless. But Saturn in the 8th house, and we're careful. So it's one of those things. Okay, I use a lot of solar returns. Someone else asked for a chart. Okay, Vipreet Raj Yoga. Vipreet Raj Yoga is where you get like 6th Lord in the 8th, 8th Lord in the 12th, 12th Lord in the 6th, or whatever. What it does is it tends to neutralize the difficulty of a specific difficulty, right? So it's actually a very specific thing. And it, again, you have to interpret it. It's like everything else I've just said. Vipreet Raj Yoga, it's a classification of things. We've heard that it's good because it takes two things that are bad, and one bad negates the other bad, so two bads equal good. So, but what does it actually mean? Right? Everything is in the interpretation. You interpret everything. Okay? And by the way, I'm teaching the advanced class on this at the Sedona Vedic Astrology Conference. And I'm looking forward to it because this is the kind of thing I really like to get into. And again, this is also what I mentioned before about finding things that you really understand and really explain them well, because most charts have some Vipreet Raj Yoga. But you have to interpret each of these house lords differently. 6th Lord in the 8th is different than the 8th Lord in the 6th or 8th Lord in the 12th. You have to interpret it, right? If it's Venus participating in the Vipreet with the Sun, well, that's different than if it's Saturn participating with Jupiter. All of it needs to get interpreted. The planet also rules another house. It doesn't just rule the 8th house. It also rules, like if it's Jupiter for Taurus, it also rules the 11th house. So if Jupiter's forming a Vipreet Raj Yoga with, let's say, Venus, and then there you go. It's the 6th and 8th Lord, but it's also the 1st and 11th Lord. So again, you have to explain it. So like everything else, it's not about what do I say about it. It's so much to say that you have to study it. You have to, the power is in being able to know what it is you would even be explaining. Otherwise, you can very easily lapse into judgments. And by the way, this is why people lapse into judgments instead of interpretations. Because with interpretation, we actually bring out all that nuance, right? That's what interpretation is. You say, Jupiter is the ruler of your 8th house. It also rules your 11th house. And it goes to the 6th house, where you see that emotional stress and worry of the 8th house brought into an area of work and service and duty, which is the 6th house. So instead of just trying to bury your fears, you're actually really trying to work through them. And it's also with Venus, which is the 6th house ruler. And by the way, 6th house in the 6th is also Vipreet Raj Yoga. So again, so you interpret it. And it's Libra, and it's Jupiter as the planet. So that's how you do it. A good astrologer can explain all of it. Because first they understand it. So again, what I always tell people that might want to study with me is that you probably have identified enough things, you just haven't learned how to interpret any of them. You haven't learned how to interpret what you've already learned. I know this. And so what students always need to be careful of is thinking that they actually know something when just because they've learned how to identify something. This is why I said before, memorization is not mastery. Being able to identify things or read about them or understand the concept is just the very basic thing. It's just a very basic, it's the first thing you have to learn. It barely gets you 2 inches closer to comprehending it, certainly explaining it. Those things need a lot of comprehension. You really need to understand what's the 6th house. You really need to understand what's the 8th house. You really need to understand Taurus. You really need to understand Jupiter. You really need to understand Venus. You really need to understand the 11th house. You really need to understand the first. So again, that's what it takes to even to interpret a simple Vipreet Raj Yoga, to interpret it well, rather than lapse into a judgment, which is like, oh, well, that 8th house ruler is in the 6th house, which, is usually not so good. But because it's in the 6th house, it's not so bad. So that's good. And it's like, what? And people lapse into this weird astro speak that is kind of masquerading as an explanation, but it's you know, not really shedding any light on anything. It's just kind of you know, spreading a lot of smoke. I'm looking at, I'm glancing over the questions. So okay. So I'm going to go down to one that was asked by Tyler about Shukra and planetary war, because it's quite interesting. There's so many different ways that people reckon with planetary war. And one of them is by the brightness of the planet. I don't actually do it that way. I look, and again, I have to confess that this is purely based on what I've seen through case studies. And there's an indication that this could be done this way. But I use the planet that's at the lowest ecliptic longitude. Now, again, there's all kinds of different indicators. I've seen 5 different ways to interpret planetary war. One of them is the brightest always wins. Venus always wins. The next would be Jupiter, etc. Some say that it's the one in the highest ecliptic longitude wins. Some say that it's not ecliptic longitude at all. It's declination. I'm glad I remember the word because I so often forget that word. Some say it's lowest declination. Now, it's not only that I've seen it, it's not just that, well, this is what works for me, but the principle also makes more sense that the planetary war is the one that's lowest because it's right underneath of it. It's like undercutting the other one. It's like intercepting the karmas of the one that it's sharing the same degree with of ecliptic longitude, not declination, ecliptic longitude. And good example, there are a couple examples that I use. One that's easy to reckon with is Hitler and Mars defeating Venus in the planetary war in Hitler's chart. Hang on for a second. Here it is. I got it. All right. So we're going to do a little switcheroony here. And here's his chart. Wait a minute. This is Hitler's chart. And you can see here that Mars defeats Venus in the planetary war. Mars is 2404. Venus is 2423. Now, some say that Venus wins because of the thing Tyler just said, and also because Venus is in the higher longitude. But it's very hard for me to see where Venus is defeating Mars in this planetary war, particularly because Hitler started as an artist, and his art life was completely undercut and destroyed. But he still remained the artist, but his art became the art of like the Third Reich, this martial art. And I don't mean martial arts like karate. I mean this art of war, this art of demagoguery and pageantry and the Third Reich and the swastika and the jackboots and the promenade is sexy and seductive and artistic and imposing and epic. This epic aesthetic that Hitler was very aware of. So he still remained the artist in his mind and in his own way. He was kind of like an artist, but it was defeated in the war. Mars defeated Venus, and what happens in the it's called Graha Yuddha in the war is the planet that wins takes the karmas of the one that it's defeating and like absorbs it. So it would either be that Venus is taking the energy of Mars and absorbing it and defeating Mars, which doesn't resonate with Hitler at all because he was Hitler, for Christ's sake. Or it's Mars absorbing the energy of Venus and defeating Venus. By the way, Venus was also his Lugna lord. this is an example. I don't remember the other one. I think it was Woody Allen, or there's a couple others that I use as an example. This one's the easiest to pull up because it's so drastic, it's so dramatic. And so this is based on ecliptic longitude, not declination, not brightness. And this is an example of why, because you can see how his whole like artistic career and artistic life was defeated by this Mars energy. It didn't go away. It just became absorbed in it. I mean, look at even now, this is why Hitler is still he's still like worshipped as a figure, because of all of that romance of the Third Reich. It's compelling to watch these big promenades and the in not Nuremberg. What was the Munich and there was a big, I don't remember the name of it. But anyway, again, like the swastikas and the uniforms and the jackboots and the marches and all of that, very much an aesthetic. And that's what Venus is. You have to understand, Venus isn't just flowers. And art isn't just flowers. Like, for instance, when you get Venus in Scorpio with like Saturn or something like that, and it's, let's say, in the 5th house, like for a Cancer person, where there's a lot of artistic tendencies, you'll see the dark side of the art. You'll see that romance, like romancing the darkness, like where the art is something very dark. I mean, we all have seen plenty of dark kinds of art. And you'll see that influence on Venus, especially like Rahu or something like that as well. So art isn't just things that are pretty. It's an aesthetic. It's what you find pleasing and beautiful, and a representation of that if it's an artist. So Hitler is a good example of how I see a planetary war working, and the planet with the lower ecliptic longitude wins. I actually had a little bit of a debate with this about this. It was several years ago when I was teaching at a conference. I won't say who the astrologer was. He's well known. And he actually argued in the reverse. He argued that no, Venus defeated Mars. I really had a hard time understanding why. He did, because he was married to the idea. I think he honestly, just to say this, a lot of astrologers form a lot of opinions, but they don't do a lot of research. I'm not trying to be harsh, but they'll have an opinion about it and say, oh no, it's the highest because it's the highest, or it's Venus because this or that. But they don't really have charts they can pull out, and I usually do with something that I've really investigated. If I haven't, I haven't. But I said, well, what about Hitler? Blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, well, I totally see where Venus totally defeated Mars. And everybody was kind of looking at him like, okay, you really want to win this argument, don't you? It's kind of hard to win that one, I think. But that's not the only example, by the way. But that's the one that pops to mind. Okay, let me. Okay, there's a good question about friend, great friend, enemy. Let me get to that in a second. Let me take a little drink. You see, I answer a lot of questions. I go pretty quick, even though I try to go in depth, but I'll try to get to them. Hang on. Don't I have nice color, by the way? I've been playing a lot of tennis. Let me get my tennis game back. Improving rapidly. The old man still got it. He's been kicking some butt. All right. So the Woodliff asked about the friend, great friend, enemy, sleeping planet. So that's what's called dignity. And again, I don't mean any disrespect to anyone, but I hear astrologers throw the term dignity around like it can just mean sort of anything they can think of in the moment. Like, oh, that's not very strong. It's not in good dignity. No. For the usage of Vedic astrology especially, it's a very specific word. I mean, again, I don't know the Sanskrit or what the Sanskrit interpretation would literally be. But the English way we denote this thing called dignity is a compound relationship between two planets. And It's based on a formula. It's quite formulaic. But basically it says that planets that rule different houses from the other planets, Mula Trikona, become friendly toward it. Others are not. So the planets have a natural relationship with each other, which is already set. Natural relationship, right? Like Saturn is a natural enemy toward the sun and the moon, for example, and whatnot. That's set in stone, okay? So the planets start with a natural relationship, which is either friend, enemy, or neutral, okay? But then when they come into a birth chart, then they wind up having a temporary relationship with each other based on how far away they are from each other, okay? So, for example, I already know that Saturn, let me go to Hitler's chart and show you, for example. I already know that in Hitler's chart, Saturn would be in great enemy dignity because Saturn's natural, you find a planet and its relationship to its ruler, which Saturn is in Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. The natural relationship Saturn has with the moon is an inimical one. But then you count how close is the ruler to the planet. And if the moon would have been in the either 3 houses in front or 3 houses behind, then it would have been temporarily a friend because it would have been close enough to Saturn to offer assistance. But since it's not, since it's further away, then it also becomes an enemy in this particular chart. So then you add it up. Enemy plus enemy equals great enemy. It's a compound calculation. It's very formulaic. It's not nuanced. Well, I think it's great enemy. It's not anything like that. It's a formula. So again, this is what I mean. You hear astrologers throw dignity around like it just kind of means anything. It's confusing because that term is used for this. And it's very important because especially when you get into certain avashtas, especially the Deeptati avashtas, which are very important. I teach these in my level 2. The Deeptati avashtas are in many ways connected directly to the dignities. Right? So if the moon would have been closer, then it would have been a neutral dignity in this chart because then it would have been enemy, which is the natural status of Saturn to the moon. And then if the moon would have been closer, it would have been friend because it would have been a temporary friend. So then enemy plus friend equals neutral. So if the moon would have been in these 3 houses of either Leo, Virgo, or Libra, or if the moon would have been in Gemini, Taurus, or Aries, which are 3 in front or 3 behind, then Saturn would have been in neutral dignity because it's naturally an enemy, but temporarily a friend in this chart. Friend plus enemy equals neutral. But because it's so far away, enemy plus enemy equals great enemy, which is very bad, frankly. It shows that the planet is acting, I believe great enemy dignity means that it's either alarm. I think it's alarmed. I think that's what it is when it's great enemy. It's one of these things where you're like, where you can't rest. Now, the other dignities that we hear of naturally are exalted. Exalted is one of the dignities. Debilitated, one of the dignities. They're often given way too much credit as being good or bad. It's just one thing. Also, the own house, the house that it rules, like Mars in this chart, is in its own sign, so that's actually the dignity. Sun is exalted, right? Jupiter is in its own sign, right? So these planets are in good dignity. Okay? And they wind up also being tied to states of awareness, dreaming, sleeping, or waking, which are called Jagrad avashtas. And so that's a little bit more complicated as well there. But it's, in general, the sleeping planets are the ones that are in the lower avashtas. Like usually you'll see a planet that's an enemy or great enemy or debilitated will be in that sleeping avashta. The ones in the middle, like neutral, even friend, neutral and friend, even maybe great friend, I would say, are sleepy. They're in that average kind of state. And then exalted or own sign or own house are what are called awake, Jagrad. And that just means that we're awake to the things that happen with those planets. It doesn't mean they're all good, never does anything bad. No, it means that the things that happen, even the mistakes and the stupid stuff, we tend to learn from when they're in the awake state. So again, dignity is very important. It's maybe the most important thing about determining whether or not someone's going to feel fulfilled, whether they're going to really learn the lesson of that planet. I'd say probably the most important thing is actually the dignity, and not necessarily exalted, because exalted is a wild card. It could be exalted in another sign where its relationship with the ruler is not really so great, particularly like Venus, even Mars. Again, it can be very tricky at times. But when the planet is in its own sign, it's always very stable because it rules that sign. So it's like you're in your own house. So the way to really look at it, again, a very good metaphor for the dignity, let me go back to Hitler's chart again, is imagine you're in your own house, right? That's the own house dignity. Like where you are right now, you're in your own house, you have all your stuff around you, so you can function very easily, you know where everything is. That's the own house. So you're very efficient, you're very comfortable. Exalted is kind of like you go to a luxury hotel where everyone waits on you and anything you want, anything you can imagine, or you go to your mom's house and she's waiting on you, and it's kind of a, of course they would bring all the stuff you need, but it's even sort of higher than having your stuff around you to some extent. But it's a little tricky because if you don't have to work for anything or it's all taken care of, you might just get really lazy. Everything can come really easily to you, or it's just a different kind of thing. It's very different than I described of being in your own place with your own stuff, right? And then you have the friend and the great friend. Well, just listen to the words. What if you're at your friend's house? What if something happens, you got to stay at your friend's house? It's not so bad, right? Let's say it's your great friend's house, your best friend's house. That's great friend. But no matter how great a friend it is, they get on your nerves at some time. There's some things you don't share, some things you don't agree on, but you agree on most things. So that's kind of the great friend. The things that you agree on will be supported and strengthened, which is quite good. Things you don't can be sources of tension. And then you have, and that's kind of the average one, the friend, the great friend. It's kind of like sleepy. And then maybe even also maybe neutral. Again, neutral is kind of like someone that you're neutral to, like you just gotta, like you're at Airbnb and you don't really know the people, but it's pleasant enough, but it's just kind of neutral, right? You're sort of, it's not helping you, it's not hurting you, it's just, or maybe like a hotel, like a normal hotel, right? And then you get enemy, great enemy. Now you're staying in the house of an enemy. Imagine someone who's an enemy. And you got to stay with them for a week. You don't have your stuff around you. You're this crazy astrology person. You like all this stuff, and they're like, they're like NASCAR, and maybe you like NASCAR too. So I don't know. I'm trying to think of things to be insulting, and they ain't coming to me. So no matter what I wind up saying, I think it's something. There's nothing wrong with NASCAR, but it's not necessarily comport with astrology, or So it's something that's not. They're blasting loud, heavy metal music, and they just don't like you. You just don't get along. They think you're weird. Now think of your great enemy, someone who is hostile towards you. Like they think your astrology is like the devil's stuff, and you got to hide it. You're alarmed. You're afraid of being found out. And there's just nothing that feels good about that environment. That's great enemy. Again, that's why these dignities are big. Great enemy is just almost as bad as debilitated. Debilitated is literally like, let's say you're actually debilitated, where you lose a limb or something, right? So again, dignity is very important. And you can see how it also relates to the waking state, dreaming state, sleeping state. Because if it's in its own place, you can do things and it's awake. You know where things are. You're conscious and aware and awake to what's going on. If it's in that average state, like with your friends, you're kind of goofing around half the time and you're just sort of, it's a kind of average state. If it's in the other one, you're like, you're kind of being triggered by a lot of like unconscious. I don't like to use sleeping. I usually use states of awareness, not states of sleep, right? Awake sounds like I usually use unconscious, at least for the at least for the dark one. Unconscious is a good way to put it. The other one being sleepy is good, and then also awake is not bad. But to say because it's actually awake, dreaming, or asleep. Asleep sounds asleep. It's more like unconscious with the. And what happens is that the life lessons associated with those planets and those dignities are sort of commensurate. The planet that's awake, when we make mistakes, we learn from them very quickly. We learn from those mistakes very quickly because it's awake, right? When it's in the dreaming state, it's kind of average. When it's unconscious, because we're not very conscious, we're triggered and we're projecting and we're not awake. We're not aware. So dignity, very important, for sure. Okay. It's very good questions, folks. I'm very impressed. And I like doing this. So very impressed. There's only a few people asking for readings and whatnot. But I'm going to look. I'm going to answer a couple more. So Andy asks Sattvic versus Tamasic and Rajasic. You can connect those things I just said with the gunas. Sattvic is more the awake, where it's conscious and you're aware of the things that are happening. Rajasic is that average, sleepy kind of nature. It's literally sort of connected to the friend, great friend, neutral. That's very kind of Rajasic. Think of how you are with your friends, right? And then Tamasic is that unconscious sort of triggered state as a psychological state, as like a yogic state. Let me see. What do we got here? There was a question that someone's at. So there's very good questions. When you look at dashas, how exactly does it work? You look at transiting planets or you take natal chart. You do all of it. Again, it's very subtle. I've taught a lot of classes about this, and you can get them. I just did a huge 2 weekends on what's called the Vedic Astrology Swiss Army knife, where we went over all kinds of techniques. It's advanced, but people that are asking good questions would benefit a lot from it. Where I show these things. There was one that was about that I wanted to answer. Where are we at? Give me a second here. Past it, then I can't find it. Someone was asking, and I think it's a good question about the chart and divine intervention and stuff like that, which is a good question. Okay, so I want to find it. Excuse me here. Ugh, now I can't find it. All right, I'm going to try one more time to find that one. Sorry to be waiting here, but I'm going to try to do it. Degrees. All right, so the question was, instead of looking all over the place for it, so the person asked about when you're looking at planets in the natal chart and the difficult indicators. How much does, here it is. Do you think that sometimes even so even though our events are predestined by planets, what about divine intervention despite what is set in planets? So here's what you want to understand. We always want to try to find something, well, is that my astrology or is that something else or something? The divine intervention is also shown in the astrology chart. There's nothing really outside of what you're going to see astrologically. Now, again, sometimes when I teach this in yoga centers and whatnot, people say, well, what about the guru? What about God? God's not in the chart. Look, it's the failure to really understand what astrology is. It says at the very beginning of Brihat Parashara that Lord Vishnu has taken form, has assumed the auspicious form of the planets, Lord Vishnu as the planets, to bestow on the living beings the fruits due to their karmas, to establish righteousness and to destroy the demons. Now, again, that doesn't mean that the planets themselves are the culminating point of existence, but we're living on a lower vibration of our karma. But the highest vibration of the karma and of the planets is what you would call divine intervention. If you can get the pure nature of any one of those planets, or when you get the pure nature of any one of those planets at any time, it's what you recognize as divine intervention. Astrology shows the different, and the planets themselves are the different facets of Lord Vishnu. Not just the planets, but all of the astrological qualities. So when you're in a Mars dasha, and you're suffering with Mars and the frustration and the irritability and the anger and whatnot, this is why there's the great story of Narasimha, who was the Vishnu avatar related to Mars, and that story of discipline and courage and the innocent mind of the child that was courageous enough to face the demon, having the innocent faith that God would show up. This is the lesson of Mars. The problem of Mars is that we lose our innocence, and then we fight like a maniac rather than retaining our mental innocence and trusting, and then having the courage to trust. This is really the power of Mars. And again, when you're struggling with Mars, when divine intervention comes, it comes in the form of the thing I just described. It doesn't come, well, that was my guru, that wasn't my astrology. My astrology is just all this bad stuff, this negative Mars energy that I'm trying to deal with. It's not. It's also the power and the intelligence and the wisdom that you're not able to express. And by the way, it comes with Venus and Mercury and the Moon and Jupiter too. All of the planets have this, they're a process, an evolutionary process, an evolving process in us. When we're looking at the natal chart, I'm looking at a certain point in the process, first with your incarnation in your natal chart. I'm looking at that sort of inherent potential to really understand and get the lesson from that higher Jupiter or whatever it is. And then moment to moment, as you're dealing with certain transits and dashas, I'm seeing which parts of that karmic nature are getting activated right now, and what's the possibility and the potential that you're going to experience that sort of divine intervention. But I know it's going to be based on whatever that influence is. There is no divine intervention that we experience as human beings that can't be understood as one of these facets of Lord Vishnu, as the planets or even as nakshatras and whatnot. So again, we're always tempted, because we see astrology as something limited, we see life as something limited, to think that astrology is some limited thing, and we project a limitation onto astrology as well. Again, this rubs some people the wrong way, because especially when they're taught that astrology is just your karma that you need to overcome, that to overcome the karma you pray to the guru, and guru's grace comes and divine intervention takes away your karma. But again, in that case, why do astrology? In that case, just forget astrology. This is what I tell people. Why are we doing astrology then? So we can figure out the puja to do what? Again, the astrology helps you be aligned with the moment. Being aligned with your moment and your karma means, it doesn't mean that you're just struggling with the lower quality. That's the default place. It means that you can connect to the higher quality and to the divine intervention that comes through that planet. So rather than being, tormented by your desires, which is a difficult quality of Venus, for example, it gets elevated toward bhakti and devotion, and divine intervention flows in that way. You might meet a beautiful teacher and guru and be captivated in nature or something like that. These kinds of things. So this this idea that we have that astrology is something limited, and we're always trying to limit our we're always trying to limit what astrology is or something like that, and it's really not. It shows our limitation. Like, as we explain things through our limitation, astrology looks more and more limited. Someone made a comment. Great, same as telling me I'm stuck on stupid without telling me directly. Annie, not sure when I did that or how I did that, but if you took that away, then sorry. So anyway, all right, so it's been about an hour and 15 minutes or so, and I do readings off and on, and you can, sign up for my email list at my websites and stuff to, get that kind of thing. And this was good. I appreciate people's questions. Y'all had some very good questions, and it makes it worthwhile. I didn't really know if it was going to be just a bunch of, my chart is this or that. And again, I don't want to be glib or cynical. I appreciate we're all going through things, but it's just, I can't be honest anyway, because I'm not going to honestly read your chart in front of the world. It's not a good boundary, and there's not enough to say, and it's only interesting to one person when that happens. So it's not a real good use of anyone's time. But anyway, so I hope that you all enjoyed this, and we'll take it from there.